capitalism definitely requires that we are cut off from access to some things that I think everyone would agree are essential.
I wake up, I am still not able to directly reproduce myself. Right? I'm not able to find the means of life except through going back through wage labor.
Yeah, you need to get money in order to live.
Right.
I think that we need to talk more about what we want communism to look like. What we're fighting for is not just that people have access to the most basic level of surviving. What we're fighting for is that everyone can live a good life.
Hello, welcome to the Verso YouTube channel. My name is Richard Hames, and I'm here with Søren Mau to talk about Mute Compulsion, a book that probably by this stage needs no introduction. Round two.
That's right.
I say round two because Søren and I spoke on Novara FM, where I'm the audio producer, about this book before. This will be a different conversation. It will be much more focused towards the second part of the book. So the first conversation we had was focused on the first part mostly, where you describe a sort of anthropology of the human. Describe how it is that the human can become entangled in the economic domination that capitalism produces. But before we get to even your book, I want to focus on this blog post available from the Verso blog called, audaciously, although not, I would hope, inaccurately, Communism is Freedom.
That's right.
We live in a period of the proliferation of views of post-capitalism. And I wondered what you wanted to offer with this particular blog post. What was it you were trying to achieve?
I just think that we need to have more discussions about, on the left, about how a post-capitalist or a communist society or a communist mode of production could look like. So I think that there's a long tradition of being against utopianism in Marxism, and I think there are many good reasons for that anti-utopianism. But I'm also becoming increasingly critical of that anti-utopianism, and I think that we need to talk more about what we want communism to look like. And so I basically just wanted to. There's a lot of people working on that and writing really interesting things about that at the moment. So there's a lot of discussions going on, and I wanted to contribute to that and maybe like try to start some more discussions about that. And that was the idea with that essay. So
one of the criticisms of that utopianism on the left is that it often simply encodes in the utopian image collections of forms of domination that exist already in the world, makes them a bit more abstract, ameliorates them to some extent. And you have this division between what you describe as the public sphere and the private sphere in your notion of communism. The public sphere is the realm of necessity. It's the things that the commune, which is the kind of the units that you describe, collectively decides that they will all produce together that form the basic conditions of life. Then there is this other realm, which is the realm of private liberty and freedom and so on. And I put to you, perhaps not entirely seriously, but I put to you that what you are describing is social democracy. You're describing a sort of welfarist social democracy, universal basic services, a collection of things that we all share in common, housing, free food, free transport, and these kind of things. And then, of course, we have this kind of realm of realm of liberty, where people participate in what even might be kind of market exchange and so on. Are you not simply describing hyper-Denmark?
No, I'm not. Well, I think the social democratic ideal is to have like a regulated capitalism. So you would still have a capitalist economy with private production, aimed at profit, and a market economy and so on, and labor power as a commodity, and all of those things that characterize capitalism. So what I try to describe in my essay has nothing to do with that, I think, because it implies that labor power is not commodified, that everyone is guaranteed unconditional access to everything they need in order to live a secure and stable, good life. And it would also imply, or it also implies the abolition of the market economy and replacing that with a democratically planned economy. So, but I'm not. Well, but I'm not sure that it was. I'm not sure that it was a good idea to use the words public sector and private sector, because I might have phrased that differently today. Sure. So the idea is just that if we want to have a planned economy, we are going to need to take decisions about what to produce. I mean, what we as a political unit would take responsibility for producing. And that would also mean that there would be certain things that wouldn't get produced by the commune, or whatever we want to call the political institutions that we are going to coordinate that through in a communist society. So you have to come up with an answer to the question about what to do with all of the needs that we collectively decide not to take care of through the commune. And basically that it was just that was the basis of the distinction between the public sector and the private sector. It was just to note that there would also be a lot of what we today would call economic activity or production that would take care outside of the sphere controlled and coordinated by the commune. That people would also be able to produce things in their free time or in their like privately. So it's something completely different from what we mean when we talk about the public sector and the private sector in a capitalist economy, and that's why maybe I shouldn't have used those terms. And as I also note in the essay, I think it can be, it's basically just another way of speaking about what Marx calls the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity. But I'm also not sure that that's actually the best, that those are the best concepts to use. So I'm still thinking about how to describe that distinction in a better way.
I guess one of the main aspects of any utopian project is that it necessarily is revisable, right? So it's not that one has a plan for this full society, but then that one offloads that plan to some extent. One has a very basic sketch and then offloads that plan into the future people for whom it actually matters. And that becomes a matter of democratic decision-making sort of as and when it needs to.
And I think that also, well, there are a lot of things that I don't have, also a lot of questions that are like obvious questions that arise out of my essay that I don't have any good answers to. So it was also just an attempt to like start that discussion and also I also don't think that we need necessarily, we don't necessarily need to have answers to all the questions. We also just need to like collectively think more about how communism could work and have general ideas for that. But obviously, we should have it. It's not a good way to think about political change that we first have to develop a detailed plan and then realize that. But I do think we need some general ideas about what kind of direction we want to move in, and then we'll come up with the concrete answers when the time comes.
Of course. And then so one of the most kind of exciting things, to bring it back towards New Compulsion, the book we're talking about, is in that book is that there is no particular division or alienation that capitalism produces from nature or some sort of natural political order. And what instead is happening is that capitalism is neither more or less natural than any other political system. And so if it's not nature that is constraining your particular utopian vision here, what is the thing that is constraining it? What is preventing me from coming along and saying, okay, you have this utopian vision, but I have this other utopian vision, I have this other set of opinions. Why can't I just do that?
Well, Nothing. You can do that, and then we can see who. I mean, then we disagree, and we can see who wins. and so it's. I think of the argument that I make in the book that you just referred to, that there's no natural mode of production. There's capitalism is not in contradiction with human nature, and communism isn't we shouldn't understand that as a realization of human nature. That one of the characteristic things about human beings is that there's an absence of, and there's no natural way of organizing the reproduction of the human species. So it's up to us. It's a political, that I think of that as like an insistence on the political nature of the human being. That it's a political question, that there's no natural foundation for that. And that also means that it's ultimately it's a question of who wins, like in the struggle for power, and so my guiding principle or idea when I think about what communism should look like is freedom, to create a society with the highest degree of freedom. And you could, of course, want to fight for something else, for your own privileges, for example, as many people who defend capitalism would do. And then in the end, it's a matter of it's just a matter of who wins, I think.
Isn't that quite a pessimistic kind of take on the structure of history, just as a mere brutal struggle for power? Or maybe that's...
Well, I think it's just I would say that it's probably a very classic Marxist view of history as the history of class struggle. But it also means that I'm not that occupied with like giving a philosophically coherent justification for communism. In the end, it's a matter of choosing which side are you on, and I'm not sure that I can, I'm not sure. It's a matter of choosing between fighting for freedom or fighting for domination, or the opposite of freedom.
Let's talk so let's talk about domination. Let's go back to the book that we have sort of behind us, in front of us. What is this thing that you describe in the book, the economic power of capitalism, or what you describe as mute compulsion? It's summed up, I think, very well in a line that you quote. Why are you locked out of your life when you are locked out of the factory? Why is it that everything in your life depends on this circulation through, for lots of people, the wage relation and other things, people for other things? You also described it as a separation of life from its preconditions. So how do you understand this?
That's the precondition of capitalism, that a large part of the population is proletarianized, so cut off from the means of their reproduction, or so life cut off from its existence.
So we have
which is why people generally in capitalism have to accept being, or not accept, but have to let themselves be exploited in order to live. Which is why it's often, as a general rule, it's not necessary for the exploiting class to use violence to maintain the relationship of exploitation. And that's one crucial dimension of what economic power or mute compulsion is. That because of the historically unique class relations in capitalism based on proletarianization, it's not as necessary for the ruling class to use violence as it was in earlier pre-capitalist modes of production.
Although this process of violent appropriation of the means of life by the capitalist class continues apace around the world as capitalism expands. So there's a sort of frontier of violence.
Yeah.
And then
exactly.
periodic
and then the violence of the state is always in the, well, not just in the background, but also in the background, in order to secure the property rights that secures that relationship of exploitation. So I'm not arguing in any way that capitalism isn't a violent system. It's an extremely violent system. It has always been, and it will always be. And capitalism cannot do without violence in many different ways, but I think especially the violence of the state. So violence was not only historically necessary for establishing capitalism; it's also continuously necessary in order to reproduce capitalism. But so my argument is more that even in the absence of violence, there's still domination at play, or the absence of violence is not the same as the absence of domination. It's just another form of domination. So when mainstream economists and people who defend capitalism say that the relationship between a worker and a capitalist is a voluntary market transaction because there's no violence involved and the worker is free to leave, then so my argument about economic power is also intended as a way of refuting that argument, or saying that even in the absence of violence in that narrow sense, it's still a relationship of domination.
And that relationship of domination is often seen as encoded in ideology. So people have bad ideas, or ideas that are wrong in a way that is more than incidental. They're kind of systematically wrong ideas about the world. They see themselves as having certain social roles, certain things as being appropriate, not appropriate in certain contexts. This is, broadly speaking, the role of ideology. But we should clarify for people who are watching, listening, and so on, that is not also what you mean, that there is a sort of tripartite division here. On the one hand, violence, on the other hand, ideology, and then this third thing. So even if we were to be free from immediate violence, which, for example, I generally am, and we were to be free from ideology, which, of course, by listening
to no one ever is, I think.
No, of course not. No,
ideology is not really something that's something that's always there. Right.
I think for the audience on the Verso YouTube, we should claim that we can free yourself from ideology, but you have to watch all the videos. And
that's right.
Of course,
that's
buy
like
all the books
the only way.
In this room, and then you'll be free from ideology. So I agree. There's no capacity to fully exit that field, and yet you mean something different again.
Yeah, and the way I try to distinguish between these different forms of power is that I would say that violence and ideology are both forms of power that directly addresses those who are subjected to it, either by addressing the body with a threat of pain or ultimately death in the case of violence, or by affecting the way in which we think or represent or understand ourselves and our surroundings. But economic power is a form of power that is indirect in nature, so it doesn't directly address the people who are subjected to it, but it addresses them indirectly by shaping and remolding their material and social environment in a way that forces them to act in a certain way. So that's why I think that it's a distinct form of power that cannot be reduced to another form of violence or ideology. And that's the reason why I think we should work with this distinction between three forms of power. There might be other forms of power than that. It's not necessarily meant as an exhaustive list of forms of power, but I just think that it's a distinctive form of power.
And so when in the kind of classical scene, I wake up, I encounter a certain kind of environment, I am still inexplicably to myself not able to directly reproduce myself. Right? I'm not able to find the means of life except through going back through wage labor, going back through this sort of circuit that contains the market. And this is the basic condition you mean. This is what you describe as proletarianization.
Yeah, you need to get money in order to live.
Right.
So you're born without access to what you need in order to survive. That's the condition of most people in capitalist society.
Can we give a description of what those things are that we need to survive? Like, can we give a finite description, or is that description itself sort of like historically changing, historically mediated? And
well, yeah, I'm. That's a tricky question. So, what do we need in order to not just survive, but also what do we need in order to have a life worth living? And it's not necessarily the case that capitalism requires denying us access to everything we need to survive. But capitalism definitely requires that we are cut off from access to some things that I think everyone would agree are essential, such as food, a place to live, and things like that. But of course, that's not all we need in order to survive. But you could say, for example, we also have like a social needs, need for being around other people, and that capitalism doesn't necessarily separate us from that. I think the most common sense of proletarianization is that we are cut off from especially some of the most basic conditions of life, such as food and shelter. And I think also that's historians such as and political theorists such as Ellen Wood, for example, makes a convincing case. I think that historically capitalism didn't really exist until the moment where people became dependent on capitalism for food. The moment where people needed to get money to buy food, that was the moment where capitalism really took off or came into being.
As the most basic condition of human existence.
Well, so separating people from access to food outside of the market. So that was the essential precondition of capitalism.
I want to come back, perhaps slightly belligerently, to this question of social democracy, because one can imagine a welfarist state, right, that solves this problem. That says you have unconditional access to food. We'll produce it on the market. There'll be, in general, marketized relations in society, but we, the state, will guarantee that everyone in this society has food, that everyone in this society has shelter, as is done in some countries that have very strong welfare programs. Does that not solve this question of the ultimate preconditions of life, if we regard those preconditions as being stable or definite or listable in this sort of finite way?
I'm not sure I would agree that actually there are any states that does that, because
we can imagine a state that does it, right? So it's not implausible to think about it. What states are you thinking about? Maybe Scandinavian welfare states or something like that. Sure, in a sort of slightly vague, kind of misty way. Yeah.
But I even in those states, the state always makes sure to that it's not a very that it's not really possible to live a good life without. It often comes with a lot of conditions and various forms of pressure from institutions that try to get you back onto the labor market. So if we, I mean, what we're what we want to create, I guess, is not just, or what we're fighting for is not just that people have access to the most basic level of surviving, but that what we're fighting for is that everyone can live a good life, and that requires also stability and not being. I guess the point I'm getting to here is that in a Scandinavian welfare state like Denmark, for example, so the state guarantees you access to basic necessities, in the sense that if you're not able to work, you can get some sort of you get money, a bit of money from the state, but the systems that manage this makes people sick, and you have to live in poverty because you don't get enough money to really be able to live a good life. So it's not really a solution to that.
I see this, and I will leave this alone after this question. But I have this kind of this in some ways, like your analysis, as we'll come to a bit later, deals with capitalism in its ideal average, right? It deals with the kind of the abstracted notion of capitalism. And so I put to you that we could have better welfarist states within capitalism that did this thing, that solved
But
this
that
basic
would
problem.
require then that. So why would anyone sell their labor power under those conditions? Like if the state guarantees everyone access to everything they need in order to live a good and stable and secure life, then why would anyone sell their labor power? And then you wouldn't have a functioning capitalist economy anymore. So if the state really did that, if the state really guaranteed everyone access to that, then there wouldn't be a labor market anymore, I think. So in a social democratic system, the state, it would always be necessary not to, it would always be necessary to make sure that it would be necessary to make sure that people would continue to sell their labor power in the market, right?
Which is, of course, what the historical tendency of social democracies is to do, right? They become more punitive over time, by and large. They try and push people back out into the market with greater sort of ferocity. And that's what happens. It is a matter of this sort of historical record, regardless of whether or not it's a matter of the essential abstract character of capitalism as such.
So, and I think another way to make the point I was trying to make before is that a truly free relationship to the market can only exist when people are not forced to enter into market relations in order to live a relatively stable and secure life. And I think that if we created that situation, then no one would sell their labor power. People would stop doing that. So a capitalist economy, also a social democratic capitalist economy, would always have to force people to, in one way or the other, force people to sell their labor power.
This is the sort of the stakes of the UBI, Universal Basic Income, Universal Basic Services, UBS debate at the moment, in some ways. That and some proponents of UBI who are keen for there to be a sort of social democracy or sort of welfarist version of capitalist social relations are keen to sort of refute this exact point you just made and say, oh no, look, in our trials, yes, people don't have to work, but they choose to work. They go back towards
but that's
work.
Probably because their income isn't high enough.
Yeah.
So if it was like high enough, I think many people would stop working for a good reason. I mean, I certainly would stop selling my labor power.
You'd stop writing books?
Maybe, I don't know. Or do something else.
Do something else. Okay, well let's. I quite like the book, so I want to make sure that doesn't happen, and therefore I'm no longer interested in the production of communism. Let's turn back towards the new compulsion of capital. You describe it at one point as a transcendental power of capital, in distinction from the kind of power that the lord of the manor in a feudal society would wield. And by transcendental, you mean something that I think is philosophically a bit opaque, because in some sense it is distinct from, terminologically, transcendent, which means to be exterior to something.
It's like the opposite of transcendent.
Yeah, it's very complicated. So, like, what do you mean by transcendental? What is the transcendental indebtedness of the proletariat? What does it mean for capitalism to have a transcendental power?
It was an attempt to use some concepts from classical German philosophy, Kant especially.
An attempt on the part of Negri, right?
Yeah, well...
Or on your part?
No, well, yeah, on my part. They use it in a different sense, but right. I'm not the only one who tries to use these concepts to describe the power of capital. Also, Robert Kurz, a German Marxist, so the idea is so when Kant speaks about transcendent and transcendental, he refers to the field of experience, that something is beyond the field of experience. That's the transcendent, and then when you're he calls his philosophy transcendental philosophy because it deals with the conditions of possibility of experience. So in a certain sense, it's what lies like if what has to do with the conditions of something, or the conditions of possibility for a certain field. And so I try to use that to describe the way that the power of capital works, because the power of a feudal lord could be described as transcendent, in the sense that there's a certain way that social reproduction takes place, that people produce their means of existence and reproduce themselves over time, and then there's like it's like an external form of power that a form of exploitation that just attaches itself from the outside to that to the way in which social reproduction is organized. Whereas what happens in a capitalist relationship of exploitation is that it reorganizes the way in which that takes place. It reorganizes production according to its own logic. So it remolds social reproduction on a much more basic level, which could be described as transcendental, I guess. So it reorganizes the very conditions of possibility of social reproduction by separating life from its conditions and reconnecting them through the market, and also by separating every aspect of the production process and reorganizing it according to its own logic. So to use that concept, transcendental, and to describe it as a transcendental form of power, is an attempt to highlight how the power of capital works by not just like attaching itself to a production process in an external manner, but by reshaping it from the bottom.
So there's a sort of thoroughgoing reorganization of the environment.
Exactly.
That structures both all of sort of the internal logic of the labor process. We've just been speaking to Matteo Pasquinelli, whose work on artificial intelligence. His core thesis is that artificial intelligence is a sort of a snapshot or a sort of parasitism on that structuring of social division of labor. I think there's a kind of interesting kind of links between your two works, but unfortunately there's not quite enough time to go into that, and I don't have both of you together. We've got this notion of a transcendental power that restructures the whole of our environment. And I'm kind of wondering how concrete and sort of immediate feeling we can make this for people who are listening to us. I wake up, again, the classical sort of like waking up moment. I wake up, and then what are the ways in which my environment is structured that prevent me, or indeed the ways that I am structured as a person with certain skills, with certain abilities, certain de-skilling features? What are the immediate conditions that prevent me from, for example, making my own food, for example, like having immediate access to shelter and so on? How would you describe those conditions, like in a sort of visceral, concrete way for me?
Well, one thing is that you would probably wake up in a place where you have to pay rent.
Yes.
So you don't like you're not you have to find a way to get money to pay rent in order to have a place to wake up in, and you have to, and then you after you wake up, you probably have to go to work in order to get money to pay rent and to buy whatever you need in order to survive and wake up the next day. So that's why all of us are engaged in market transactions many times every day for all of our life, or most of our life, and because capitalism has to, or relies on, market dependence and the creation and the reproduction of that market dependency.
There's a little patch of land immediately outside my window that I can see, like a kind of a little small park, like a city park, perhaps like 10 meters across. And I think sometimes about whether or not I could go and plant some crops or some food in there, and then like immediately reproduce myself using this little bit of land. And then I realized I don't have any crops, first of all, because I would need to go and provide them through the market. Yeah. And then also I don't know how to farm. don't really know anything about food production.
no.
And then, of course, everyone else around me would also be trying to use the same group, a bit of land, if that were possible, to do their production.
And it's someone else's property or public property or anything, something like that. And if anyone found out about it, you would probably be arrested or something like that.
Yeah, pay some sort of fine or something.
So there's a state that guarantees with violence that certain property rights are upheld.
So we're assigning this moment to which the state comes in, the police come around and ask me what I'm doing and then take me off to jail or something, right? We're assigning that moment to, in our distribution of power, to violence. The fact that it doesn't occur to me or everyone else around me to do this, can we assign that to ideology?
I'm not sure if it's possible to give a general answer to that. I think that, although it's possible to distinguish between these forms of power, I think especially in the case of the difference between economic power and ideology, it's possible to conceptually distinguish between them. And I think it makes sense to do that in order to understand how they work. But in reality, they're never separate. And they mutually reinforce each other in many different ways. So I guess it would always be a combination. Actually, a combination of all three things, like ideology. There would be the violence of the state in the background, that the police will show up and take you off to jail if you try to violate property rights. Maybe you would also there would also be ideology involved in many cases where someone would think that, or people would just generally not think about property as a political or social and historically specific thing, but just like a natural or just thing, and that would be the ideology part. And then there's also the economic power, and I think that so in most cases they always they work together and at the same time, and then in different situations one form of power may be more important than other forms of power.
And the overall argument of the tendency in the book is that mute compulsion is becoming more and more thoroughly entrenched in capitalist society as it goes along.
Yes, but I want to add to that that's not necessarily the same as saying that economic power gradually throughout the history of capitalism or something like that replaces other forms of power. So yes, there are certain historical tendencies, dynamics in capitalist society that means that the economic power of capital gets stronger with time, but that does not mean that the other forms of power are not as important anymore.
Let's focus on food production again, because one of the most kind of intriguing aspects of the book for me is this notion of the real subsumption of nature. And you're very keen to, well, first of all, let's talk about what is the real subsumption of nature? What do you mean by real subsumption in this case?
Well, real subsumption is a concept from Marx, and it refers to the continuous material restructuring of production processes. Especially Marx is especially interested in the labor process when he talks about real subsumption. So it's a concept that is designed to understand how capitalism constantly reorganizes the labor process in order to make more profitable production, to increase productivity, or and this is important, to increase the power of the capitalist over the worker in the workplace. So it's not just technological, for example, changes under capitalism or organizational changes in the labor process and all of the different social and technological reconfigurations that happens all the time in capitalism. The aim of that is not only to increase productivity or to make cheaper products and more profits. It's really important to see how it's also there are a lot of examples throughout the history of capitalism of technologies, for example, being introduced in order to make sure that the capitalists control the labor process. For example, by de-skilling workers, which is not just a matter of prices and cost reduction by cheapening labor power by lowering wages, but it's also a matter of being securing the control of the capitalist and making it easier for the capitalist to replace workers and thereby to discipline them and so on. So real subsumption is a concept that Marx primarily uses to talk about the labor process, but so I follow a lot of different scholars, and especially Andreas Malm, in talking about using that concept also to understand capital's relationship with nature and the way that capitalism or capital reorganizes natural processes in order to secure its power.
If we think about the history of farming, this becomes quite sort of concrete in some ways. So if we start with, say, farming in the early 20th century, we largely have quite small-scale producers who have things they directly own, for example, bits of machinery that they directly own, land perhaps they directly own, or so tenant farmers on a large bit, so that's a bit different. And then they have seeds that they have got from the previous generation of seeds. The previous harvest. And then they're probably using skills that they have acquired in some sort of relatively informal way, although there also is sort of a education system there as well. Many of those different parts are then marketized or kind of brought into market relations. So, for example, tractors are this like very important part of it. Let's just talk through some of the kind of the material changes in the practice of farming that you outline in the book in terms of like the way in which that process is subsumed into capital.
I think that's a hugely important aspect of how capitalism has developed in the last 100 years or so, and also important for understanding the basis of the power of capital today, like how it has changed, how capitalist agriculture has changed, and how capitalism has, in a certain sense, the real subsumption of agricultural production didn't really take off until, or at least we could say that it accelerated from the 1940s onwards. And one of the important things was, for example, the introduction of tractors and harvesters, or what's I forgot what it's called.
Combine harvester?
Yeah, harvester, like all the machinery that people use today in that is necessary to use today in industrialized agriculture, and that's what it is. It's basically become another branch of industry. And that requires introducing all of those technologies requires farmers to then buy a lot of things on the market, and so it's that's one of the consequences of that. But those technologies are that's one aspect of the real subsumption of nature in capitalist agriculture. Another aspect is the way in which you also had to develop crops that would fit the harvester machines, and then also the development of especially artificial fertilizer is an extremely important development also, and pesticides, and then also all the different biotechnological manipulations of plants and also of animals that has led to an increase in productivity. All of that has meant that capitalism has reorganized the natural conditions of the natural conditions of society in a way that has, I think, greatly enhanced its power in the last 100 years. And I think that's really important, because the reason why it's one of the reasons why it has strengthened the power of capital is that it makes it a lot more difficult to transition to another mode of production.
Yeah.
So I think it would have been a lot easier to start producing food in a non-capitalist, post-capitalist way, like 100 years ago than it is, or 150 years ago than it is now. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's an important basis of the power of capital today.
And people often did, right? So people often had, for example, chickens in a yard somewhere that would give them eggs. There's this kind of like small-scale food provision that goes on basically in Britain at least until the 1940s, and then is kind of rapidly tails off.
One of the aspects of this real subsumption of agricultural production is also the degree of the international division of labor, and when we think about how, I think most people would probably agree that when the revolution will happen, it's not going to happen everywhere at the same time. It's probably going to start somewhere and then spread from there, or start in multiple places and spread from there. And when that happens, people will need to find a way to feed themselves in those revolutionary zones, right? And so you can imagine how difficult that will be if you have like a large region where you only produce 2 or 3 different crops, compared to a situation which would be much more likely 150 years ago, where you would have like a wide variety of different things that were produced in agriculture.
Which is one of the sort of connected to one of the reasons why the subsumption of agriculture into capitalism was so intensely resisted, because having a diversity of crops is also a way of preventing very large degrees of risk that come with agriculture.
Exactly.
Having a single cash crop means that it can fail, and if it all fails, then you are destitute. So this is kind of the different degrees of cut that bit at the end. Sorry, I'm kind of waffling there. So that process of intensifying the international division of labor and the division of labor in agriculture means that market relations are much more, like, people are subjected to market relations in a much higher degree than before. I'm sort of wondering about this sort of tantalizing notion that you put out earlier, that there is another 4th or a 5th or a 6th mode of power as well. And I'm wondering if there's this sense that we have that capitalism is becoming more and more entrenched because of these kind of different factors that we're talking about. Its capacity to technologize nature directly, its capacity to reorganize social division of labor on an enormous international scale, and so on. I'm wondering if there's also a sort of a sense that something like what is referred to as the grave diggers, the bourgeoisie grave digging themselves, does that return at any point in your work? Do you think there's a kind of a way in which the entrenchment of capitalism dialectically transforms into its overcoming, or is there simply a different kind of thing that happens later?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me. If I think the idea of capitalism producing its own gravediggers is true?
Yeah, so if we have a notion of the capitalist, that mute compulsion or economic power is entrenching and entrenching and entrenching and entrenching,
Yeah.
It's clear that violence is not diminishing. It's clear that ideology is not diminishing. This other one is clearly tendentially densifying. How does we get to a situation in which the question of, say, revolutionary politics even makes any sense? Right?
Well, I don't think that. So the idea about capitalism producing its own gravediggers, I think that's a quote from the Communist Manifesto,
Yep.
and I think that was the idea there was that capitalism would by itself actually organize the proletariat and capitalism would create a development where the proletariat would be united in huge factories, unified in huge factories and huge cities, and their conditions of life would be similar to each other, and they would kind of organize the revolutionary. Capitalism would, in a sense, organize the revolutionary force that would lead to its own overthrow, and I think that was not a very good. I think that that's not true. That's not what happened. Capitalism also has a lot of developments that does the opposite of uniting the proletariat. So in that sense, I don't think that capitalism produces its own gravediggers, but I do think that capitalism undermines itself, not just like periodically in the forms of economic crises, but also in the long term, or especially its relationship with its own natural conditions. So I think what many eco-Marxists have argued is true, that capitalism is incapable of reproducing its own natural conditions. So in the long run, capitalism will, I think, collapse because it will generate an ecological or collapse, or it will. But I think before we get to that point, something else will probably happen. So I don't think it's a very likely historical scenario. But so I don't buy the classical collapse theory, the classical Marxist collapse theory in an economic sense, because I don't think that. I think we should understand crises as a cyclical phenomenon in capitalism.
And a phenomenon that then retrenches by clearing out the inefficiencies of capitalism, then retrenches forms of capitalist domination again.
But I think in an ecological sense, it's a different question. I don't think capitalism is capable of, in the long run, of reproducing its own natural conditions.
It's just the James O'Connor thesis, the second contradiction of capitalism. I'm interested then in how you relate to that idea that you spoke about earlier, which is that capitalism as a social system is no more or less natural than any other one. But if it destroys its own natural preconditions, doesn't that suggest there's a sort of a almost naturalistic critique that one can be made?
No, because it's not any less natural to undermine itself than not to do that.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, okay. It's a different kind of philosophical question, for sure. You're working now on the anthropology of the capitalist scene. Do you want to tell us anything about that?
Well, yeah, something like that.
That's what it says on your website. This is
yeah, I am working at the moment on something like a Marxist philosophical anthropology, so a theory of what human nature is, and what and one of the things that I'm especially interested there, or one of the things I'm especially interested in at the moment, is to try to develop a theory of freedom and historicity as something that is rooted in the structure of the human body. So I'm and I think that there are some very interesting things in Marx's writings about the body that can, and suggestions about that connection between freedom and historicity in the body that can be developed further into something like a philosophical anthropology, or at least something like a theory of what is the human being, and how some of the unique human capacities are rooted in the structure of the human body and the specific relationship the human being has to its natural surroundings, and the what Kate Sober calls the biologically underdetermined nature of human beings. So there's a passage in the German ideology where Marx writes that humans have history because they produce, and they produce because of their corporeal organization, and he doesn't really develop that thought further there, but I think that that's a really intriguing idea, that humans have history because of the way that because of the specific structure of the human body. So I try to develop on that idea and to basically try to construct a theory of the corporeal roots of historicity and freedom.
That sounds very enticing indeed. If you're interested in hearing more about Søren's work on that sort of anthropology, on the question of vulnerability, on the question of tool use, on the organization of the human body, you can have listened to the previous conversation we did, which was much more focused on that on Novara FM. Søren Mau, thank you for coming to Verso.
Thank you.